going to get started. Maybe some others will stream in. Thank you all for coming. We're so excited to have Perry and Nat here with us. It's a real pleasure and such a treat to have you both here at the same time. Perry, I've known through, Perry's going to speak first, and then we're going to hear from Nat Chard. Perry is an architect and an associate professor of architecture at the University of Michigan. I had the pleasure of meeting Perry at the University of Michigan when I was teaching there many moons ago by now. But then he came to Australia and saw Melbourne and RMIT where I was teaching, and been able to keep in touch across that long distance and lots of time. So happy to be back here nearby. Before arriving to Michigan, Perry taught at SCI-Arc, the Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles, for 17 years. His interests include, and we'll, I'm sure, hear about some of these tonight in the studio. We are hearing about them today and engaging in some of these amazingly sort of impassioned ideas about architecture and drawing. So the generative potential of architectural drawing, the spatial opportunities afforded by using diverse design methods, and in broadening the conceptual range by which architecture contributes to our cultural imagination. He fairly recently published a pamphlet Architecture number 34 entitled Fathoming the Unfathomable, Archival Ghosts and Paradoxical Shadows, co-authored with our other guest, Nat Chard. Recently, his work is ventured into the digital world, hoping to make sense, or maybe nonsense, out of cut and paste and magic wand operations in Photoshop. Fantastic beasts have also been on his mind. Please join me in welcoming Perry Culper.
That's quite nice. Thank you very much, Gretchen. It's really nice to be here and to be here with Nat and Gretchen and the students today. It's been a really, really good day. I'm sorry I've been a bit tired today, just not enough sleep. But so what I thought I'd do is, in retrospect, I think I've thought about how you construct a practice, or how I construct a practice, and I've gotten a little bit more deliberate about how that happens, and be a bit more strategic and tactical about it. So I thought I would set up a handful of key influences for me and things I think about, and then look at some work. Is it possible to turn the lights down a touch? Could we turn the lights down, Mike, a bit? It's just, these might be a little sharper. So for me, one of the important things to do is to acknowledge where things that have influenced me, people, phenomenon, objects. So I keep track of a range of influences. Some are alive, some are dead, some are Eastern, some are Western, some don't distinguish between East and West. But they're just, I've just been asked this morning, in fact, to recommend the 10 most important drawings for me in terms of my development. And these kinds of things interest me, to try to track lineages, etymologies, origins, and influences. When I work, which is not very often lately, the work table looks a bit like this before I get set up, and then, as Gretchen mentioned, I'm trying to open Photoshop once in a while and do some things there. And I'm interested in now, I don't think, for me, it doesn't matter. Digital manual conversations are less important than working effectively on things. So I would like to have digital skills and manual skills and hybrid and composite skills and so on. So I'm not a drawing guy or a digital guy. I'm not really interested in that. Those distinctions, I am interested in the preferences and biases of each of those means of working. If I showed you one image, this would be it in terms of constructing a practice. These are, to more or less degree, these are things that are in each proper piece of work. I think about or leverage these attributes or characteristics of a practice. Gretchen mentioned The first thing is I think architects only restructure relationships representationally and or materially. I think that's all we do. So that's an overriding aspect, and I think of relational thinking and relational assemblies as temporally active, things which are relational contours which are constantly reassembling and reconstructing themselves with respect to temporal conditions or situated conditions. So that's the key thing that then the bits below basically draw from. Gretchen mentioned the capacity of drawings, design methods, which I think are enormously important, and then how we conceptualize work. The naming problems, roles of language folds, analogies, tailored visualizations, and homogeneous ideas are things on the ground that I try to leverage, and then I try to understand the bottom set. Nat's really encouraged me, the kind of latency. I've come to understand latency and nascent things as an important part of what I do. Mechanics of engagement has to do with the roles and variables, the variables and the roles and durations and weights that the components of a piece of work have. And then 13 Ways is related to Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, and my interest in the stanzas, a blackbird is never described but always pointed to from different vantage points. And I'm interested in trying to develop design aptitudes that really move around work in a lot of ways to make more culturally durable or thorough work. I won't touch on these directly, but excuse me, I believe Architecture 101 includes representation, includes the history of ideas. If I were to author a program, the history of ideas would be the first grounding mechanism. Developments in optics, mathematics, geometry, philosophy, religion, and so on, because I believe architecture to be a participatory discipline that talks to things, whether in the history of the world, whether we want to or not. So design methods are a really, really important part of that, and how we work, and it would be a part of Architecture 101 as well. I don't think I know anyone who directly works on design methods as a pedagogical contribution or critical reflection on, and I personally, it doesn't matter if anyone else in the room thinks this is important or not, I wouldn't know how to be an architect unless I had some sense about design methods, where they come from, what their preferences are, how authors interface with them, what they do well, what they don't do well with respect to directness or indirectness in spatial terms, how you use them in combination, and so on. So that's a really, really important thing to me. And then drawings are as well. So these are 13 ruminations or thoughts about drawings and how they might matter or not matter to others, but they matter to me in terms of building an atmospheric condition and ambience for understanding the capacities of drawing. I worked, those look really, really big. The drawings aren't this big. I was fortunate to finish at Columbia, and I spent some time in Peter Eisenman's office and Bob Stern, and then Denise Scott Brown and Bob Venturi. And when I moved to Los Angeles, I had opportunities. I thought I was going to practice there, and I had opportunities to work on a guest house commission. I was invited to a competition in West Germany at the time based on a 15th century text called the Hypno-Tamachia. And I also had a commission for a real house, a client-based house in one of Southern California's deserts. And these all happened at the same time, basically 1990. And as a result of making them, I began to realize that they all seemed the same to me in terms of how ideas were framed, in terms of how I worked on them, even the formal and material languages. And that it really seemed problematic to me, internal to the work. And I was also just starting to teach at SciArc. And there were a lot of big characters with a lot of muscles moving around who were leading some conversations in Los Angeles, in the States, and sometimes globally, and I realized that I didn't have much to say relative to their emerging and transformational practices. And so I made that last house, I made a version of that house where I started to open up the architectural drawing, and I called these aspectival drawings, which tried to build out the primary attributes of something, the aspects, rather than the perspectival synthesis of things. So they were meant to be fragments of things that were important, that didn't necessarily attend to spatial continuity and even constructibility. So that was part of the discussion, but the second part of it was that I began to understand that the architectural drawing had more latitude than I had previously understood, given my training and my thoughts about what drawing models and constructs could do. So a handful of years later, I had now been teaching at SCI-Arc for about 6 years and had been doing a bunch of thinking and a lot of travel between Cambridge, England, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, spending chunks of time in each. And it occurred to me that I needed a way to really further the work that I was up to in terms of architectural drawing. So I found a competition which had no program. I thought this might be useful for me to force me into places to think about the scope of the work, how to work on it, how to formulate a discipline for working. And I developed this drawing, which I called a strategic plot, which tried to look at what I understood after I researched islands and islandness, and from literature to films to cartographical representations and so on, to just try to understand what capacities islands had or might have. Then I said to myself, I identified about 12 interests that I had, and that had to do with things to do with isolation, things to do with panoramic and panoptic vision, things to do with insurgencies, cyclical things, mythical folklore, nautical cartography, and so on. There were territories that I wanted the work to touch, so I tried to invent a drawing technique that would allow me to put those ideas into play and to then formulate programmatic thinking and strategical plotting of kinds of ideas that I had. So it's a really, really pivotal piece of work in terms of me believing in the capacity of the architectural drawing to do work. That carried on then through 5 years later, another piece of work, and I'm doing all kinds of intermittent pieces of work and little things in between, but this is a competition for a museum in which I continue to think about now tailoring drawings to work on the things that were at stake in the particular phase of the work where I was working. So this is a thematic drawing. This tries to breathe energy into the primary ideas for a museum. And I developed, then subsequently, I was trying to think about bridging drawings where I could bridge to the next level of development of the work without dropping things off from the previous phase, but also incorporating new things that I thought were important to the work as it emerged. So these are called cryptic drawings. They're basically kind of genetic codes for proto-architectural, proto-material elements that are linked to the thematic interest, but trying to now find a kind of genetic or cryptic or glyphic language prior to form where I could begin to formulate some ideas about form and material, let's say. Other kinds of drawings, another kind of cryptic proto-formal drawing, same museum project. And I was progressively trying to think about how to carry interest forward and transforming those things and finding relational combinations of things that seemed like they might be useful for me in formulating an attitude about the project. And trying to use whatever I could know about the work at that time, whether it was language prompts or profiles of elements or material suggestions or indexical conditions, to try to hold things in place simultaneously. different languages of representation. So this has become really, really important for me because I don't understand everything at equal levels. The lions can't jump to the platform for me at the same time. So I let things that move between hunches, certainties, and flat out shots in the dark exist simultaneously in drawings no matter what the phase. And then there's some early renditions, sort of chipboard model equivalents of what that museum might be like at a first pass. And then there are other kinds of drawings where I really bracket the world out. And here, for example, I was thinking about erasure as an architectural, spatial, and representational activity. So I made a series of drawings where I put some proto-architectural elements, spatial profiles, outlets, lights, a piano. I made some marks in the drawing, and then I systematically began to erase and recode those just to understand erasure as a part of a larger piece of work to do with the house I was trying to work on. And there's another piece of work. There are several related to erasure, in which I was trying to use the art of painting by Vermeer to get to the art of architecture by erasing. This is, 3 or 4% what the work would eventually be. I'd been working slowly, hard at work, but working slowly, so I had raced on my bicycle on the road when I was in my mid and late 20s, and I began to understand the distinction between fast and slow twitch muscles, and I have quite decent slow twitch muscles as a cyclist, but my fast twitch muscles, both as a designer but also as a cyclist, were in remission. So I developed a piece of work that I called fast twitch, and I tried to use an analogic method for thinking about the piece of work to produce a house quickly, basically a house in the desert. So parts of the architecture would be like prehistoric animals crossed with a streamlined trailer. The gardens would be like cryptographic language tablets that you found in the landscape. So there were a whole series of likenesses that allowed me to work on the work quickly. At least ideationally, the drawings took a little bit more time. But in this case, for example, I'm working on a composite drawing where section, elevation, notational things, and distributions of removed parts exist simultaneously in the drawing. So lots of work which has to do with simultaneities and keeping things in play long enough so I can recognize whether there's any juice to be had relative to the work that I'm doing. The drawings also, the manual drawings also supply quite a lot. There are traces of things and construction lines and improbable relationships that just come about as a result of making the drawings. So I've also grown more attentive to the construction of the drawings, and that the drawings as objects, but also constructions, but also communicators of future possibilities. The drawings can exist in all those levels. We were looking at the ceiling of El Jesu today in the workshop, and this work relates to an interest in breeding landscape elements, landscape typologies, and landscape biologies as a way to produce temporally active architecture. And sometimes I will use sites for other things or other sites to allow me to work on certain questions and conditions. So I found a beautiful set of images of orchids here and dragonflies, and began to make some modifications formally, morphologically, but also in terms of introducing aspects of biological, temporally based things into a kind of site. Analogical drawings, so same project, spatial blooms, but trying to develop analogous relationships to properties that I thought the landscape architecture might have, to try to discover by working outside of myself analogically and then visualizing the analogic relationships to see if there was potential in these three landscape contributions towards a new form of temporally active architecture landscape. So there are a whole series of studies which try to explore those three ingredients and how they might relate, but by using different representational techniques. So eventually, I always say that this got about 10% down the road, but there are notational landscapes, there are graphic landscape conditions, there are things like zipper blooms and test tube berms and fabric predators, and so there's a whole set of things there are false shadows, there are false constructions, there are a whole set of things that got put on the table but never really developed through this interest in landscape, the landscape breedings. This is a quasi-related piece of work that was started. Our daughter was about 5 weeks old when this was started, but I was asked to deal with architecture as a transient phenomenon, and I developed a cross between metaphor and atmospheric in a kind of metaspheric zoo that used aspects of metaphor and atmosphere to produce effects to do with transiency. And the idea was that I was using animal logics, animal behaviors, interrelationships, reproductive techniques, territorial logics as a way to help me work on transiency outside of a human modality. And these are details of a kind of strategic thematic drawing that began to try to put characteristics, the animalistic characteristics, in play with a handful of programmatic elements, roving taxidermy, a botanic surface, and a vessel for obsolete atmospheres. Those were the kind of fixed programs to carry some of the ideas, and then the animal characteristics were played out through a big drawing. Then I think Nat's really been disciplined in terms of letting one piece of work move into another piece of work. I don't think he's nearly as jumpy as I am, but I work across a range of things. So here I just got interested in vertical surfaces, just envelopes that might allow us to rethink skins of buildings, basically. And there are a couple of these in play and 4 more queued up. Gretchen mentioned that we were able to produce Pamphlet 24. We're very, very fortunate to be given that opportunity. And I basically piggybacked a little bit of thinking onto some conversations that Nat and I had been having. I piggybacked onto his thinking through the drawing instruments and what was entailed there. And we were trying to work on questions of contingency and indeterminacy in architecture at a certain level, things that didn't predict how we would behave, but might offer opportunities for opening up our own commitments and understandings and translations of spatial possibilities. And so these drawings are some early drawings that I made to try to think. This one was trying to figure out, for a laboratory that would investigate drawings, this was trying to figure out, well, what kinds of components or gear or spatial conditions would such a realm have? This was related to that, and this drawing was also related to that, but Nat and I were also living, he was in Canada at the time and I was in Ann Arbor, so this is also a discussion about a basement and an attic and giraffes and periscopes, but also the business to do with thinking about architectural drawing and ways we might get involved in contingency as a way to both develop a friendship, which I think is the way this started. Just we shared some conversations and we basically said, let's see if we can do something maybe to draw our friendship out. And I've been super, super grateful for that. But we basically, he'll show some of these, I'm guessing. He's been working on these drawing instruments, and I'll let him talk about those, but we then staged 2 drawing instruments that would get involved with one another. And as a sort of, each one has a dome, which has a kind of narrative set of condition. Each one of them has something which interrupts paint throw, and each one of them has a kind of drawing surface. And I'm not sure we developed a practice out of this, but we were able to thicken some early conversations and to think about how we might, through work, both develop a friendship, but also develop things that we both think about and sometimes share, but we think about other kinds of things that are quite independent from one another. And these are some images that Nat made of catching the paint throws. And again, I'm a bit jumpy, but when I turned up at SciArc, we were taking students out into the American Southwest, and I realized we're talking about landscape and temporalities and scale, you know, mega scales and horizons that bent and so on. I realized I didn't know anything about the landscape, so I set up a format for myself where I made 18 by 24 inch double white trace bases, and then I made 9-inch by 12-inch frames, and just would work in series on, you know, a color that I had on my work table, or the middle ones are fungal landscapes. I was looking at calligraphic things and scroll paintings, Japanese and Chinese influences, so that these drawings were motivated by a range of, from materials to someone giving me a piece of a poem, to do with iris clouds, an homage to my father, series that I made to do with aspen trees that had to do with our time in the Sierra Nevada and backpacking and so on, sort of archaeological ones, blah, blah, blah. So I made about 750 of these, and I stopped making them in 2004, not because other things kicked in. I don't throw any away. I don't make judgments about them. I work on them very, very quickly. And I, in a construction of a practice, I've tried to just lead a bunch of, say, parallel lives, one interested in erasure, one interested in trying to work on landscape conditions or building skins, or this body of work where I just make little word ditties that are complete projects, basically, but these try to keep my conceptual imagination open in terms of what spatiality might talk about. They're organized, and I haven't made any of these for a long time. I should have registered the things I've thought about since I made this initial list, but I've organized them according to 7 categories that I think of as contemporarily, let's say, important or discussable territories. So materiality, fabrication, production, and atmospheres, ambient structures, and change and flux, multiple temporalities that can have to do with change and flux, duration also. So these 3, 4, and 5 are somehow looped into one another. But if you just look at a couple of them, you get a sense that they're finished projects for me, because I'll never get to them, but because I'm also trying to work on speeds of working as much as how I work and what I work on in terms of developing a discipline or a way to practice. It's become increasingly important that I understand I can work at different speeds, and that working at different speeds comprises different levels of insight and reflection about what I do, as much as the slower work or the middle speed work. The interest that Gretchen mentioned in her introduction, I wondered if I could A, open Photoshop, and B, could I begin to pick certain things like the magic wand, and could I basically use found things, either found in my own work or found in other images that interested me? Could I basically just pick parts, collage thinking, and produced what I call speculative house, garden, and landscapes? So they're meant to be essentially drone views of prospective domestic garden and landscape environments. And I've made about 150 of these. These are also made very, very quickly. And here's a case where I just used a drawing of mine and some Photoshop operations to speculate, both as a way to open my formal and material vocabulary, if that's what these might suspect, but also to think about domestic environments, gardens, and landscapes. So these are, they're made probably somewhere between 45 minutes and 2 hours. And again, I have no skills, so I'm using some of the spatial blooms work to see if I can speculate on something. I mean, I can open Photoshop, but I could use the transform tool a little bit, but I don't even know how to use layer mask, for example, that our friend Mark West put me onto a week ago. So, but I really like doing this work because it's, I'm also non-judgmental. You know, there are a dozen that I think are decent, but I don't make judgments about them. And I try to, this is like the word ditties. This is work that really tries to just keep me a little bit alive and well about what might be possible spatially or representationally from a kind of conceptual point of view. I'm not interested in clients and budgets and building codes and so on in this work, but I'm interested in trying to see about what might be possible. I'm also interested in reusing materials. It's just a collage sort of thinking, can I use things in ways to reveal other lives or other potentials within them? So these are made from my drawings, also from digital models that belong to my work and drawing parts and so on. They're really, really fun. I had a really nice conversation with Steve Hall in the early 90s, and he was talking about doing watercolors, doing a watercolor a day. And I had started to do the landscapes, and he was interested in seeing them. And we just realized that both of us really both enjoyed the one-a-days. And if you kept at it, you could accrue, maybe you could construct some knowledge or at least reflect on things in the construction of a practice that might matter to you. So, just the wall's just getting longer right now. These aren't more or less interesting to me or to you, but they're just also because I don't make very much time to work these days. They allow me to have a sense that I'm doing something. And I like also thinking about what they might co-invent, what things might come out of them. So I'm interested in reflecting on them a little bit now and trying to suss out what other things, what other projects, what insights might come out of them. As a result of that, a good friend, Jeff Halstead, who taught for 2 years at Michigan, saw some of them, and he said, he's a sort of digital wizard, and he said, you know what? He said, let's have a go. If you're interested, let's have a go at seeing if we could take them out of the image realm and see if we could take a really quick first pass at spatial material things. So this is a drawing that I made. It's based on it's the vertical surface work that takes some bird motel modeling things and tries to comprise a landscape, a house garden landscape. And then this is a quick pass on what formally might be available to us. And then this is one of mine, and this is a digital model translation of me. And then these bits. And this one interests me because what we did is we took one of my drawings, and that's sort of the yellow part, and then we took another one of the drawings because I realized I was just sort of making villas, and I began to wonder if we could do 3 houses, 3 gardens, and 3 landscapes in one. So the black marks, the white marks, and all the blue marks are a second house, garden, and landscape that now begin to couple themselves with the first one. More Photoshop work where I was just trying to think of they're in recipes, they're ideas in this, but I don't need to go into those. But I was trying to get 4 particular kinds of elements in these proto-surface, proto-object things, and I made these last Christmas, basically midnight to 1 a.m. just finding material, and then I got really interested in how Photoshop operations, like in the upper part of the red, where I'm so clumsy to give it a configuration or to get the atmospheric figure to turn into a graphic thing, I just take the white paintbrush and drag it. But I got really interested then in the the operations of Photoshop, and there are a series of these in which I take the white background and by changing this, then all kind of stuff begins to emerge. And I started to get interested in how that might parallel my construction lines and templates, and so on. The construction of it got as interesting to me as the effects or the production of the possible surfaces. So just, again, a series of these that just finding things from old military aircraft and parts of my drawings, and just seeing if I could invent entouragic things, ground-like conditions, possible surface-like things. And this is another shift where I got invited to make a bird house with 29 other architects in the world. So they gave us an iconic sort of house profile and out of foam. They were the sponsors, the people who made the foam. And I said, I'm not going to do that, so I'm going to do something else. And so we made a series of inspirational drawings to try to catch some of the early ideas. It was made very, very quickly with 3 former students at SCI-Arc who just finished. Anyway, we made a series of inspirational drawings to do with this motel, and then ultimately made a physical thing where the ideas, this has been important to me. I haven't acted on it, but I've begun to think more about physical things as a way to incorporate some of the thinking that I've been doing. Anyway, there's a bird landing strip and a spiritual bird. There's a garden. The black thing is a black bird rug. There's a sort of feeding realm that sits on the bird black rug. There are 3 clouds, the sort of the ovoid pieces. Those are artificial clouds for the birds in the motel. The upper left-hand cloud has the name, the Flights of Fancy Bird Motel, so it's somewhere between a billboard, a cloud, and a special room, which is the windsock room. There are 5 bird perches. There are 2 surveillance instruments for the birds to watch skies, and there are 3 hedges on the upper middle part of the disc, and one of the hedges also stores bird perches. So those are the things that belong to it, and then these are some of the images of the object. And the things, the programmatic elements, try to enhance the ideational framework for the work. But also the physicality of making this had its own logics and intelligences, from 3D printed images that became figurative, or 3D models that became figurative. Then we tried to paint them, and that produced a set of effects that we weren't expecting. Introducing feathers and bird nests into things. So the material feedback loops were really, really helpful. And then we just made a couple of studies. Actually, there are a series of these studies that basically take the bird motel on a walk and try to introduce it into other environments, of which this is one, to try to tease out what situational specificity, if the birdhouse was a thing, what other situations would draw out the capacities of the bird motel in other ways that weren't expected, but also how the bird motel might then reconstruct an image, let's say, of a flamingo's head by occupying it, sort of surrealist thinking. Out of that came a second bird motel, this one a floating one, which also looks at human, non-human relationships and uses human programs as sort of tropes to reflect on the domination of humans over non-human conditions, but also to then use those programs effectively for birds. So for example, in the background, there's a stuffed technology garden, which is based on trophy rooms and hunters, ravaging natural life and then bringing them back as sort of honorific pieces in Dallas in a room that's made for them. So this stuffed technology garden has all kinds of aerial things in it, rockets and planes and satellites and so on, but they're all clad in a floral material that the birds then could enjoy. And there are bird perches, and there's a berry festival, and then there are dancing bird alphabet topiary garden pieces. So these foregrounded things move around and track, and they inscribe intelligences on a dome below, and blah, blah, blah. So it got quite elaborate in terms of being a place for birds, but also reflected on human programs and tried to reroute them back through the bird realm. Also using drawings that I'd made as surfaces that would change over and through time. So there's as these things travel in the world, both in representational worlds, say a sectional drawing by Boulez, or Baroque domes, or over an airport, that there would be intelligences that were inscribed, data-based intelligences that were inscribed into this surface, and the surface would change its characteristics relative to its environmental status. So if predators could see it from above, Google Earth, that this would have the capacity to change its surface characteristics so it couldn't be seen relative to, say, Google Earth imaging. Anyway, there are a whole set of versions of these, of which there's one in the upper left-hand side. This is sort of a bird and a half, looking at my drawings and the morphology, the possible morphology or changes of the bird motel in an environment. This is both the pictorial representation, but also trying to use the drawing to affect different temporally active environments where clouds are becoming wings and figures hover in a sky, and the bird motel has different statuses as it moves through a kind of an environment. So trying to use the environment as a way to study certain effects that the bird motel would produce and effectuate, and vice versa. Then one last bird motel. Similar kinds of thematics, but the elements are different. Thematic interest. So this one's an homage to Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. And it basically skywrites parts of Wallace Stevens' poems as it moves through the sky. And it has a talisman or an honorific bird that cares for the bird motel. There are many of these in the world. It has an artificial weather garden, which is sort of right in the center of that left-hand piece. It has a working log. It has housing. It has an interior shrine and spa-like thing. It's got a rotating restaurant. So that's the artificial weather garden in its first iteration on the left. And it's got an homage to Loger and the primitive hut. This is a zoetropic restaurant, the sort of purple thing, early days for all of these things that moves with the motels as they sort of move through the landscape. There are also different versions of it, and all kinds of other thinking, but this is fairly quick. The work's really not worked on heavily, and it's fairly quick work and would need a lot more for it to be proper. And I'll finish with a set of images and projects that have been recently of interest as well. Nat and I took a trip to a place called Orford Ness on the east coast of London, the UK, and we were trying to speculate about a project or projects that we might do there. And one of the thoughts I had was to develop what I call aerial diptych follies. And they're essentially useless objects that they both collect data and do surveillance on military operations and future things that might happen on this land spit. But they also have a spectacle component, so they're meant to be circus-like elements that construct and reconstruct events in the sky. So these are analogic drawings that I made of 3 of them. And I got a little bit of funding then. These are made relatively quickly to analogic, again, drawings that try to visualize these diptychal follies. We got a little bit of funding last summer at Michigan to explore the relationship between image making and modeling. So we worked on how my notations might become spatially figurable in modeling space, or how images might begin to suggest things that might be in the model but weren't suggested in the image. We got interested also in the workspace, in that there was potential in file sizes and resolution and RGB in relationship to CMYK. So I took my original drawings, and each of the three drawings then have a particular thrust in terms of what they're trying to work on. So this one is a kind of representational thrust, and we're interested in everything's modeled there, and again, just working simply on image modeling relationships. And I think if I could go back to one piece of work that I have, it might be this one, the continuities of this one. Recently gotten interested in the other kinds of information that are in a digital model. In a wireframe, for example, is not quite the same as let's say, a rendering. And what might the opportunities and potentials be to examine different levels, different kinds of information within the digital realm, whether it's image-based realm, modeling realm, computation realms, and so on. So I think this holds, the work holds quite a lot of promise for me in terms of what's locked into the machines that might be uncorked or unraveled as architects move forward in a digitally driven world, but also that might affect content or construction logics or other kinds of discussions that architecture, spatiality, representation might take on as a result of probing operations, let's say, and between image and modeling in our case. So these are all just models of, they're models of the analogic drawings that try to stir other capacities. So this one was interested in the entourage, the things that it might also expose. So the drawing, obviously, that I made is the middle-ish in a different state now, but also trying to wonder about the environment that it might co-construct as a result. And then wireframe images, again, trying to look at another kind of potential within the information of the digital models. So these aren't really about, they aren't about these aerial diptych follies. This work is not about them at all. They're just sacrificial lambs, essentially, to work on a series of questions to do with image modeling relationships. And then I'll finish just with the last one. Same base kind of drawing. This one gets interested in things partially that might be seen or not seen in images. So this is essentially a perspective view of my drawing. And then there are a whole set of things which emerge that weren't visible in the image, but might be visible in modeling space. For example, that little, right in the middle left, there's a kind of floral pattern as a part of the drawing linked to the content of the early analogic diptych follies, or aerial diptych follies. And then you can see this is the world that lies on the other side of that other information, this stuff on the right-hand side. And there are things in this piece of work where there are instruments that are helping to corroborate certain forms of information to produce other effects in the digital modeling space. In this one also, in the last one, there are parts of the bird motel because they were being worked on at the same time. So there are parts of the floating bird motel that start to populate this new piece of work that doesn't have anything to do with these aerial diptych follies. So again, everything's modeled, rendered. We're just trying to probe, the construction logics of a digital model, file sizes, downloading models in relationship to constructing models, how images get translated through modeling space, in this case, Blender. So cumulatively, I think that this is a cross-section of some of my work that has helped me. It's been a part of the construction of a practice and that I occasionally try to reflect on in terms of what the work's about and why I do it and who it might matter to. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but I'll just finish my part of the conversation tonight with 24 I likes. So if I said that there was one image, if you could hold something in your heads in terms of me constructing a practice or things that I care about, these little bits are things that I like. And I don't know how much I care about them or how much they affect a discipline for producing work, but there are 24 I likes that try to move across architectural education, the work of an architect, the discipline, and try to say something through things that I like that for me have both reflective and critically framed positions relative to the discipline and the practice that I've tried to develop, but are also trying to lean forward, lean out, get ahead of the equation in terms of what I think about. So I quite like the last one as maybe the favorite one of these 24. It's actually the 25th one, so it's a sort of a baker's dozen gone twofold. Can you read those? Are they clear enough? So this is also a kind of set of values and sensibilities and use of language that I care about in my own work and thinking, conceptual prompts. It's a kind of a collection, it's not a synopsis, but it's a kind of hoarding of things that I care about in 24 points. So that's the end of the road for me. Thank you all for coming, and super nice to be here again. Thanks to Gretchen and the students in the Academy for having us. Thank you very much.
Do you know how to get your...
Should do.
There you are. While Nat's putting his images up, I'll do the introduction and say thank you again to Perry. That's just a dizzying amount of work and amount of time. And Perry always says how little time he has. We know he doesn't sleep very much. He must not with all that work. But the amount of thought and care in each one of those hundreds and hundreds of images is just incredible. And in their bios, you can tell they've been teaching for quite a long time and just incredible educators. And so we're, again, really lucky to have them here for an extended time for our 2-day workshop halfway through today. I met Nat, actually, when I was a student, as a PhD student in Australia. Nat came as a speaker for an event that we have, a symposium around design research and doctoral research in architecture. So I was lucky enough to meet him there and to have feedback on my work when he was there giving crits and lectures to the rest of us, to all of us, and some really amazing feedback that I really benefited quite a lot from. So it's interesting, just this, coming here to teach a workshop. The students have the benefit of that, and I also had that benefit many years ago now. So Nat came from London a day or two ago, so he might be a bit jet-lagged. But Nat has the title, an amazing title, of Professor of Experimental Architecture at the Bartlett. I don't know how you managed to get that title. It's just all of us would, I think, strive towards that. And again, I think the work that we'll see from Nat and as well from Perry is really great here at the Academy and also in our discussions in architecture, because it does really point to ways in which you can construct a practice around experimental methods and ideas and have faith in that as a practice, which we'll see again in a minute. The Bartlett, as you know, is the University College London. Previously, he held professorships at the Royal Danish Academy in Copenhagen, the University of Manitoba, and the University of Brighton. He taught at the Bartlett throughout the 90s and also taught at North and East London universities. He's an architect registered in the UK and has practiced in London. His work has been published and exhibited internationally. As we mentioned earlier, they co-authored the Pamphlet Architecture 34 together. His research practice develops means of discussing uncertain conditions in architecture, and the recent work has been acted out through a series of drawing instruments, which we will see tonight. So please join me in welcoming Nat Chard.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gretchen, and thank you very much for the invitation to come to this hallowed place. I've tried to restructure the way I've talked about this. I typically run through work sequentially, and thought it might make a little bit more sense if I started at least more recently and then went back to how I got here. So what I'm working on at the moment is a series of tools to help me occupy the space that I'm interested in, which started out in this sort of general body of work being the uncertain territories of architecture. There's architecture claims to do many things, and I think our experience of it is maybe often quite different from those claims, but nevertheless completely understand the logic of things like programs and so on as a way to get into the possibility of making architecture. And yet so much of our lives seems to take place quite outside of the things that are imagined by the architect in making projects. And so a lot of the work I'll show are a series of instruments that are trying to work out how do you discuss uncertain possibilities in architecture and how you might address that, and certainly how you might draw those conditions and through drawing experience those conditions to a certain extent and be able to reflect on them. And the work has really moved on to thinking about how these, not just learning from the conceptual basis of this work, but learning very practically from making these tools about how one might go about designing. So these are pictures from Swedish polar expeditions, and I find them pretty interesting in terms of the huge difference in the pieces that are discussed here as a way of trying to sort of find out about the territory in which they're operating. And the instruments I'm just embarking on are similarly different pieces, but are wondering how one might develop the methods of designing architecture, maybe much more based on the site, one's relationship to it, how one might conceptualize the place through the instruments and from very particular positions on it. So I've been working effectively on a sort of donkey. It goes forward. This is a very scrappy sketches because it's an unformed thing, but this is maybe the context for the donkey, which is four quite large drawings that form a panorama. And the donkey itself in the bottom sketch is the beginning of it, and the drawings are marked on the wall behind, is a really a character similar to the ones represented in the panorama that's sort of leapt out of the drawing. And it's witnessed by a pair of seats that I'll talk about in a minute that have a horizon that is marked by the blue dots. And the front of this donkey has a drawing on it that melds with the drawings that form the panorama. And so this is the sort of situation. And the donkey holds a seat and as typically and a drawing board. And so the hope is to occupy the space of the drawing through this piece. it's not just the place of the drawing, but also the time. These are a series of plates from La Jetée, Chris Marker's La Jetée, and I was very interested in this, how a film that was so much about time was able to structure the partition durations as stilled images. And so this is a sort of question for both the background and the drawing surface of the donkey. It's held up by this frame you see here. And the back of the drawing is very much a back, contains things like, there's a space up here to take a 1/6 scale drawing of the drawing surface to make the subsequent drawing, and then that then fits in the pocket on the back of this drawing with a series of other pieces. Takes drawing equipment. Here's the chassis. So that's what I'm working on at the moment, and it's witnessed by a pair of chairs that I mentioned, and these chairs are trying to accumulate the knowledge that's acquired through the various drawing instruments, and a point of reflection on how the project is developing. This is an earlier version, and these emerged through a set of drawing instruments, and their situation is very much influenced by this photograph by Robert Doisneau on the south bank of the Rive Gauche in Paris, and you can see the Samaritain, the old department store on the other bank. And what seems captivating about this picture is that it seems so much more familiar to how one exists than the rather more homogeneous fictions of architecture that we might propagate. All the relationships, apart from the couple snogging at the lower level, are non-reciprocal. We have the policeman looking at who we might presume to be the mother, who's looking wistfully at the couple snogging below. Meanwhile, the child, who we presume is attached to the mother, is looking out of the frame. None of them, apart from the couple, none of them are in a reciprocal relationship. And also in Alain René's film Last Year at Marienbad, as mentioned in the workshop earlier, there are a number of scenes where the characters looking outside of the frame, implicating worlds beyond what we're shown. And these were driven by Alain Rogre's fascination with Piero della Francesca's paintings and frescoes, where he plays out similar spatial adventures. And this is the earlier version of the chairs, with a series of characters involved in a similar set of relationships that seem to be simultaneous amongst the triptych of drawings, yet you might notice very slight differences between them. So these might, although be of one instant, might be one might be of one spatial consciousness, one might be a memory, one might be of reality, etc., etc. And the chairs were found through this set of drawings that are in a similar set of relationships as to the characters in the drawings. They throw paint at each other, and the reason for doing this I'll get onto later. They throw latex paint at each other. And this developed as a way of drawing that allowed me to modulate the degree of uncertainty in each act of drawing. Each drawing has a paint catapult. I used latex paint because it's a non-Newtonian fluid, like blood, and forensic scientists have both analog and digital methods for divining the narratives out of blood splatter. And as my paint catapults throw paint at a model, that then deflects this splatter onto a picture plane, folded picture plane that I'll talk about later. The splatter becomes really the at least the sort of permanent nature of the drawing. There are two ideas of uncertainty in this act of drawing. One is just like the sort of question of what will happen in a situation, and so that's maybe represented by the trajectory of the paint. Before I started making this sequence of instruments, I hadn't made a paint catapult before, and was surprised how sort of accurate they were in their line and length. But each throw of paint is completely unique, and so it seemed like a very nice resonance with architectural occupation, and it's not just a random chance generator or something. It's allows a sort of range of repeatability, but without reliability. So these are some views of the instruments. So, and so the paint's thrown at the model, and the throw is the sort of question of what might happen in the situation, and then the splatter that comes off the model is maybe much more the way in which each person that experiences the situation might understand it in their particular way. So these are the instruments before any paint is thrown. This is just me in there just to give it scale, to get the size of it. I think people normally think that these things are about this big. Generally, they're about sort of this sort of size. Yeah. So you see the model there in the middle. It's a figurative in these cases. It's a figurative model of the chair, but as the difference between any one of us at a scale of 1 to 6 would be so small in terms of throwing paint, there are a series of rather more abstract paint deflectors on them to discuss the person. And here we have throws of paint caught through high-speed photography, and in this set of instruments, I've developed my own paint throwing spoons, and these examples are using a bifurcated one where you see patterns of resonant throws between the white and the orange paint. The setup, and aftermath of some throwing. Again, in the aftermath, one of the chair models, and this is a throw of paint. So I'd resisted this using high-speed film for a very long time. In making the throws, I only capture when I trigger the high-speed flash for the photographs and the camera manually after also manually firing the paint catapult. The extension lead for my camera is just such that I can only just about reach both at the same time, and have to sort of try and judge when the thing's going to happen. And the whole process of aiming the catapult, having a desire for what it might do, having a bigger desire for what it might do beyond the desire for what I want it to do, the question of what the drawing will be like, whether I will capture the paint in flight, and whether it will tell me anything, build up the sort of levels of anticipation and uncertainty of indeterminacy that represents within me the situation that I'm trying to discuss. So I'll take a step back. This is quite a few years, and this is a series of drawings of a space, a hall and a staircase, where looking at the emerging technologies of the time, things like intelligent gels and so on, that were promising maybe the possibility of making a world that was much more itchy and would relate to us in a much more discursive way. was wondering what such a world would be like. And these are sort of slightly bizarre worlds, but what I became interested in was how we might construct a spatial consciousness of such a condition. So here's a drawing of two people walking together. The sort of great big snotty thing is maybe an idea of their collective spatial consciousness. The grey fields are both what they're perceiving directly and what they're imagining just behind them, what the state of the thing to be and so on. They're registers of context, which are really much more placeholders and so on and so forth. And this is really just a way to try and understand what the players are, and then trying to imagine how it is that we might understand ourselves, projecting ourselves onto the world. Simultaneously, I was developing a series of projects that looked at the same question. You know, if that's asking the question how to make an architecture that one can take possession of as one moves through it, simultaneously looking at how could we take possession of the world as it's given to us. And architecture makes, it's a sort of very brief, I won't talk about that because it's not so interesting, but the problem with the first version was that it was using emerging some nanotechnologies and so on, and because in this sort of fantasy anything was possible and there was no sort of poetic resistance. So I took the whole project very seriously, calculated all the flow rates, made it as realistic as possible. And the strategy was that as architecture and the city make so many claims about their relationship to the body, I thought, well, if I take those sites that have the most direct and practical relationship, if the claims of architecture in the city are true, then by changing our relationship to them, I would therefore, for the person with this architecture inside them, be able to change the city or architecture on my own terms. So those sites are things like hygiene, heating and cooling, especially digestion and waste and so on. And these are the layers of the equipment. These are airbrushed over 5x4 Polaroid transfers. So each of these images is just 5 inches by 4 inches. So that's why they look a bit ragged, blown up this size. But these are the progressive layers of that equipment. And then these are from a manual of radiography. So on the left is the X-ray, and on the right is the positioning, the sort of didactic photograph of how to position for that. And you'll see selective amounts of content given away in each situation. On the left-hand side, of course, the X-ray, getting some of the heat transfer and oxygenation, respiratory apparatus. And on the right, we see just above her pelvis, we see the formal appearance of some of the equipment as a sort of formal transparency poking into her flesh. Another view, and then a much more frontal view of the digestive system. So these are some of the instruments that I've been working on. The first one, instrument one, is a very simple piece, and it's wondering how to draw these sorts of conditions. And one hunch is that maybe the picture plane is a very active agent for me. So I'm sure you'll know this image by Holbein, The Ambassadors. And typically, as we look at a picture, we're so used to the idea of the frame and the whole idea of picturing that it doesn't really matter where we stand in relation to it. We all understand it in the same way. But of course, with the anamorphic projection, we are absolutely implicated in where we are positioned spatially in relation to the image. And so this seemed to be one opportunity to how we how we might be able to sort of spatialize the image and open it up to question. Another way is very much related is the question of folding the picture plane, and this is Samuel van Hoogstraten's peep show of early 1660s. Has two little peepholes either side, and you look into this box. And in this box, sometimes the picture and the image are reconciled. So on the floor, the floor of the box, the floor of the picture is painted normally like a plan. But when the floor in the picture goes up the wall of the box, it gets projected anamorphically. This seems like this disjunction between pictorial and material space also seemed like a real opportunity. So in this, I cut open Van Hoogstraten's box and built a camera with a lot of side on it to get an idealized view of the box from one of the peepholes. And I think you can see, I hope you can see clearly the difference between where's the box and where's the picture. And on the far wall of the picture, the paintings above the doors appear on the ceiling and wall of the box. And so if I shine a light, and then talking to Daniel earlier about this, but if we shine a light through these doors up onto the ceiling of the box, that light coming through the far wall appears to land on that very same wall. So, of course, absurd situation, as we know, light is so well behaved and does exactly what it's told, and so this seemed like a very sort of promising way, where a situation where only the observer can really make sense of this. And this is a peep show of mine that's like this instrument was lost by UPS several years ago. So here's, this is the instrument, and it has a folding picture plane at the top. And it's discussing, when I moved to Copenhagen, what I thought was a generic body project that I showed you earlier, I realized how particular it was to London when I was moving to a different climate, different culture, and certainly different diet. And so also in the intermediate time, a whole load of medical technologies had overtaken me, things like left ventricular assists for the heart, for instance, circulation, had become much more miniaturized than what I'd drawn. So these are stereoscopic, by the way. This is not just a sort of obsessive compulsive thing of drawing things twice. They're stereoscopic pairs. But this is a revised version of the body projects, and how the folding picture plane is very simple in this instrument. But if you look at this map of Copenhagen and look at these various globules in it, by foreshortening the view, that we can coalesce parts of the city and so on through that foreshortening. And here's one of the drawings made from it. Again, folded as a surface, implicating you where you might stand, etc. Early version of that instrument. So instrument 2, the folding picture plane seemed promising, and so tried to take it much further. And how this works, there's a model in the box under the dome, and that is illuminated by a bulb in the box, reflected off a mirror and through the lens of a 5x4 camera onto a folding picture plane below. So this is the surface that folds, etc. And this is another view. And if we take it slowly, whoops, whoa, what's that doing? Take it frame by frame, you can see as we fold the picture, maybe go just between those two maybe. So you can see as we fold the picture plane, It chooses to take the image that is being projected in various ways. Sitting on the picture plane is a model, and this model is a larger version of the model in the box, compensating slightly for the cone of projection. And what this does is cast a shadow onto the picture plane that appears to be of the family and attached to the projection. So when we get to an image, the shadow and the projection of the object seem to be synonymous, yet the shadow lies on the pictorial surface, not on the pictorial depth of the perspectival projection. So see, these are some of the frames, and yeah, there they are. Okay, so the picture plane, you can see it noted there. I'm sure you're all very familiar with drawings like this, and if we look at if we look at the picture plane there it's stuck behind the object. But if in this diagram, based on Leonardo's 3-column rule, we see the picture plane interrupting the space between the observer and the object. And what he's pointing out is that if we have a flat picture plane, the distance between A and B is longer than between C and D. And this is antithetical because the middle column is closer to the observer than the one to the left, and yet we know in perspective things that are further away should under the same size should appear smaller. And so what he and many artists, and there are various treatises on the picture plane of history, but what artists have done is they've curved the picture plane so that either the equivalent of the outside columns will either be the same size as the middle one as you project them up, or will be or would be smaller. So to understand this possibility, my conjecture was that if you can make the image more true by folding the picture plane, then of course it also must have a critical capacity, and that's what I'm trying to use in these instruments. In all the instruments. So I decided to have a look at this world of the habitat diorama. This is the Libyan desert group with background painting by James Perry Wilson. James Perry Wilson, he studied architecture at Columbia and worked for Bertram Goodhue in New York for about 20 years until the Depression. And then he painted in his spare time, and then became diorama painter at the American Museum of Natural History, and apprenticed for a short time under William R. Ley. And he then developed what he called his dual grid method of projection, and brought the sort of rigor of architectural perspectival projection to the world of dioramas. So to understand his method of projection onto these curved surfaces, where you have both the idea of the curved picture plane, but also the curved surface, junction of pictorial material space. I studied his method, and these are his original Kodachrome slides that I've stitched together, but in such a way that you can see. I've not blended them in any way, so you can see the difference in exposure and so on, and their boundaries. He used paintings, field studies in painting for color, and photographic slides for geometry. But of course, in making these slides, you're getting a faceted picture plane, and what his dual grid method did was convert these facets into a smooth, curved surface, first onto like a Hawke picture plane, a semicircular surface that he would then project onto whatever the shape of the diorama was. So this is one of his grids drawn over one of his slides. For a sphagnum moss bog in Connecticut. And so this is, he made the diorama of this at the Yale Peabody Museum, and he made those slides on June the 17th, 1949. I built some cameras that would do all his transformations, all his projective transformations in one photograph. These are the cameras, this is the tooling for them. And this is the photographs. On the left-hand side, a pair, one of the diorama and one of the site, and located as in a scale model of the diorama shell on the right, flattened out. This is photograph outside of my office in Copenhagen. They built an opera house between me and the city, so I left and went to Canada. This is a very practical picture taken with Polaroid film to get the exposure, but it's in nearly the same place as the first test photograph from my camera. And so between these, you can see the anamorphic distortion constructed by this camera. And this camera is dedicated to this particular diorama in Yale Peabody. So this is on these characters. This is Ruth Morel, who helped Wilson paint this diorama, and Michael Anderson, who's really works at Yale Peabody Museum, is really the expert on James Perry Wilson. And my camera's set up. I don't know if you ever tried to take stereoscopic photography in a sphagnum moss bog, but it's very critical you get the horizons even, and just as you set this one up and move to the other one, this one goes, and it was interesting experience. Anyway, this was on June the 17th, 2001. A photograph with a normal camera of the site, and then with my camera, so you can see how the arc of the horizon gets flattened anamorphically, and then the diorama with a normal camera gets flattened out by my camera. And this is James Perry Wilson painting the mule deer group, and you'll notice that maybe if you can see it, that in this example he's painting rather than the photographs. So there's a question of whether he was using his method for this. That he is on site painting that painting, and it was a question of whether he was using his dual grid method for this diorama in the American Museum of Natural History, and it's very hard to tell from the drawn grid in the charcoal underlayer. So made these diorama scopes. And you see one with a curved picture plane, one with a flat picture plane, which was another method of projection used by people, discussed by Francis Lee Jaques, another rather brilliant diorama painter at the American Museum of Natural History, and was able to work out that he was indeed using this. I think it's conjecture, but I think he used the painting just because it had a slightly better horizon to work for the foreground. Anyway, so as using a sort of studies of these dioramas to really try and understand the opportunity of the picture plane, but also making these instruments because of course the world that we profess as architects through things like the program is one of explicit knowledge, one where we can tell each other, write things down and communicate it in a lecture or something. But all these sort of worlds of uncertainty can't rely on explicit knowledge. If we had explicit knowledge and uncertainty, of course, it wouldn't be uncertainty. So we're working much more with the world of tacit knowledge, and a lot of what these instruments are doing is trying to enter into a world where I can construct tacit knowledge. The model, I forgot to mention the model on the picture plane, which I was describing, and the shadow, it constructs a paradoxical shadow, one that appears to make sense, but actually only makes sense in the sense of the observer. This is after this instrument was destroyed by Air Canada Cargo, coming back from an exhibition. Built another version, Instrument 3, which is a sort of hot-rodded version, discussing design of a house, my family's house in Winnipeg, Canada. Okay, so Instrument 3 did pretty much everything I wanted it to do. It did it very well. I could predict pretty much everything it was going to do. In most normal senses, this would seem like a wonderful success, but if you're dealing with indeterminacy and uncertainty, it's an unmitigated disaster. And it became clear that I needed to work with something that was much less obedient than optical projection. And yet I'd invested so much in the possibility of the picture plane, and it seemed so promising. I was wondering, how can I work with a curved picture plane with another medium? And that's when I started working with flying paint. And Instrument 4 was really a sort of media test. It was promising enough to make 4 versions of Instrument 5. These discuss a bird automata test track and operate on the sort of terms I was discussing earlier. So I won't talk about the model very much, except to say that it's a model. It's an architectural model, but acknowledging that it will be occupied by flying paint rather than by people. And if we take something like Edward Maybridge's Palo Alto photographic field, where he's making these strictly scientific photographs, this one, both Perry and I very much like this one, is chickens frightened by torpedoes, another highly scientific exploration. He's sort of he's inventing a new architecture. It seems very, very nice world in the world of indeterminacy, because, of course, the typologies, we're so familiar with things that we know how to deal with them, how to behave in them, and so on. So I was looking at a few research centers, as Etienne Jean Marais, born within a few days, died within a few days of Maybridge, and working in very, very similar realm, also in physiology and chronophotography. Make these wonderful abstract images of the human body doing very scientific things like jumping off a chair. And similarly to the semi-pornography of Maybridge, Marais apparently also very much liked dressing men up in very tight clothing, but also made these extraordinary chronophotographs of birds, and the models out of them. And my bird automata test track is sort of picking up on some of those very early drawings I showed you of the hole in the staircase, wondering about what an architecture would be if it was more like an automata, where it could somehow talk back to us, not be quite such a passive construction, maybe tease us to become more active in the world. This is a very sort of early, portable, generic version, and the ones in the instruments, Instrument 5, are the sort of looking at subsequent versions. There's etc. And here's underneath the domes are some characters. So she's working at what is maybe ambiguously between an operating theatre and a workbench for these birds. I think one of the joys of the diorama work was that I thought I would understand something about the picture plane and optical projection onto curved surfaces and so on, which I did, but of course it was a rabbit hole that went in very many wonderful places, and realized how important the uncanny might be in the realm of uncertainty. And there's another character tracking the progress of the bird. These worlds under the domes, these instruments are clearly instrumental, and sincerely so, but they also have the appearance of didactic instruments, and this is an attempt to seduce you to take their images seriously, given the nature of a lot of the material that comes out of them is a little bit like reading tea leaves. So when I made the first drawings with this, with a curved picture plane behind, it all happened very quickly, and I thought, well, maybe what's happening might also be interesting. So I started using high-speed flash photography to reveal the behavior of the paint. And as in a lot of sort of technology transfers, if you like, the other day we visited the Henry Ford Museum, and there's a train, an early train in there, and all the carriages are horse and carriages put on railway wheels. And this is a little bit the same. You know, I thought, well, I've got the projector, I've got the object, and I've got the screen. I'll catch the shadow behind the object. And of course, there's a problem, there's a sort of signal noise problem, as you can see, that the splatter that I'm interested in is getting completely obliterated by the stuff that's not saying anything. Nevertheless, it starts to work. This is, of course, Harold Edgerton learning his very thorough architectural research, seen in these very high-speed photographs, and it's obviously learning from him. Here's some, as I get to learn how to work the thing, here's some more images, and start to get much more of the world I want as well as the world I don't want. It's my favorite one. As you can see, these have very similar trajectories, but each throw is unique, as I mentioned earlier. You can see some of the, I won't talk about that. And there's, in terms, another pleasure of this is that these drawings that seem so instrumental, a friend, Mark West, took them and messed with them on the computer a bit, and then started painting over them to make completely other worlds. So, looking at the pieces in the model, as Perry mentioned, Perry was when I was doing these, Perry was in Michigan, I was in Manitoba, and just sort of discussing our work, and Perry was asking me about these pieces, and I was discussing it in terms of how they registered things. These are Canova's very particular registers, and Ewan Uglo's in his paintings, very sort of personal registers, and how these pieces were really describing the space through highly programmatic and instrumental elements. And I said, a little bit in the way that the interior of a submarine is constructed entirely out of program. And Perry wrote back saying, I've never been in a submarine. And so I took a couple of photographs that I'd taken inside the Argonaut at Parc de la Villette in Paris, and I put a stereoscopic pair together, because then you get a much better sense of the density, and sent them off, emailed them off to Perry, and then can I get a? Is it possible to get the? No, it's not. then put them together and had a more careful look, and there was something a bit funny about it, which I immediately realized what it was. And if you remember the paradoxical shadow in instrument 2, what I discovered in here was a paradoxical shadow. And what's happening is if you look at the shadow of the periscope eyepiece, the black periscope eyepiece, and look on the left-hand image, how close it gets to that circular white dial to the right of it, and then you look at the distance of its shadow on the right-hand image, you can see there's a parallax between the two shadows. Now, in stereoscopic photography, you take a left-eye view and a right-eye view, and which I did, and normally you have a stable light source, which is sun or something. But in this case, because it was so dark, I was using a flash attached to the camera. And so there was a double parallax. There was a double parallax of position and a parallax of light source, which made, when you look at this stereoscopically, makes the shadow float in midair, which, if you think how the shadow has been used in architecture to make ideas true, seems like a very, very wonderful thing to have in your possession, to be able to float shadows in midair. So I built instrument 6 that just floats shadows in midair in front of you. It's a very beguiling thing. When using the candles, you use polarizing filters to achieve this. But when you use the candles, the image is very slight, and one's perception registers this shadow floating in midair. But it's quite tentative, it's just on the edge of perception. And your consciousness says, no, this is naughty, you're not supposed to do that, put it back. And so you get this shadow sort of meandering in depth. It's really very intoxicating experience. And if you can go cross-eyed, you might be able to see the floating shadow there. Here's a whole load of people witnessing. When you use and this is an exhibition Perry and I had in Canada a few years ago, and when you use electric lights with it, it's much more reliable. And this is just the Institute of Paradoxical Shadows. And yeah, I mentioned earlier about the signal to noise problem. So instrument 7 just puts the folding picture plane adjacent to the object rather than behind it. And so it largely just captures the splatter, and also the folds are really so much more active. It's very slight folds do a lot of work. So same story. Yeah. And this Perry's talked about this. I mean, it did seem we won the competition for the pamphlet, and there's a question of how do we'd been having this conversation at long distance, only met each other a handful of times, and in person, and we thought, well, how do we work in terms of in a resonant way, and so throwing paint between our various worlds seemed like a decent way to do it. Yeah, so there's more of the images, and again to give some sort of scale of the exhibition in Canada. These are some photographs by Alphonse Bertillon, a criminologist, very sort of interesting didactic project in Paris, where the cities are getting, at the end of the 19th century, cities are getting larger and larger, and the question of people knowing everyone and so on diminishing, and the question of identity becomes a really important spatial idea. He's developing all sorts of ways of establishing identity, but also this crime scene technique where he's trying to calibrate the photographic field. I mentioned this relationship with the floating shadow, and I was wondering how to calibrate its depth. So I was looking at these attempts to calibrate the photographic realm, and this is there's both a shadow maker and rhinoceros cast shadows and some calibrators to measure the depth at which the shadows might float. And the rhinoceros was chosen as a sort of curved surface to see how active the screen would be in figuring the floating shadow. Chose a rhinoceros partly because I was, where are we? Can't see it. Where's it gone? Very jealous of Perry's giraffe on his instrument. But also because in James Perry Wilson's white rhino diorama in the Akeley African Hall of Mammals at the American Museum of Natural History, apparently the back of these rhinoceri, or the further one, is painted white so that it reflects as much light as possible, because obviously if it cast a shadow on the painted background, it would collapse the illusory construction. So there it is in action. Yes, I thought I'd taken this out. This is just Carlo Molino's. Do you know this project? Carlo Molino's apartment in Turin looks out to the Po River, south-facing windows on the right, and the grey surface surround. He had this fire surround made, a sort of half-scale fire surround for his fireplace, and the surface around it was all mirrored, and it's all bleached. It's all bleached out since he made it, except for the shadow of the fireplace, where it's remained silvered, and so you get this shadow when you look into it has an amazing depth, and this seems a very nice opportunity of the encourages me to continue with the possibility of the floating shadow. So, and now we get to the end where we started of instrument 10, where which is really the instrument that tries to learn from this sequence that I've taken you through. Thank you very much.
Because it was double lecture, we have to vacate the room. So we won't do, and it's late, I'm sure people are hungry. We won't do questions now. Over dinner we can, or for those of you in other departments, come by tomorrow. Nat and Perry are here for the second day of our workshop, so you can chat with them then if you like. Thanks so much.